Henry Morrison Flagler co-founded Standard Oil with John Davison Rockefeller. Rockefeller later said he wished he had had the brains to think of it, but the truth was that it was Flagler who conceived the corporation, wrote its charter, and designed the railroad rebate system that crushed every competitor in the American oil industry. By 1880, Standard Oil refined 90% of the nation's petroleum. Flagler took that fortune south and built something no private citizen had attempted before or has attempted since: an entire coastline. The Florida East Coast Railway, the Hotel Ponce de Leon, the Royal Poinciana, the city of Miami, the town of Palm Beach. He constructed the infrastructure, founded the settlements, established the newspapers, and bought the legislature. But the story of how Henry Flagler built Florida is also the story of a woman locked in an asylum for 35 years, a law written for one man and repealed after he used it, and a railroad across open ocean that the Atlantic destroyed in a single night. Henry Morrison Flagler was born on the 2nd of January, 1830, in Hopewell, New York, a village in the Finger Lakes region where his father served as an itinerant Presbyterian minister. The family lived at the margins of rural poverty, moving between congregations that could barely sustain a clergyman's salary. The elder Flagler had been married twice before, as had his mother, and the boy had been named for his mother's first husband, a man called Henry Morrison, who had died before the child was conceived. It was a borrowed name attached to a boy who possessed nothing else to borrow and no inheritance to anticipate. At 14, Flagler left school with what amounted to an 8th-grade education. He walked to Republic, Ohio, and then onward to Bellevue, a town in the flatlands south of Lake Erie, where a half-brother named Dan Harkness ran a general store affiliated with the L.G. Harkness grain operation. The boy started at $5 a month and room and board. Within a few years, he had advanced from the stockroom to the sales floor and raised his pay to $40 a month. He learned the mechanics of commerce in the grain belt, the cost of a bushel at the elevator, the freight charge to the eastern seaboard, the margin that survived between the two. These were lessons he would apply at a very different scale. By 1853, Flagler had married Mary Harkness, a relative of his employer's family, and entered the grain business as a commission merchant in his own right. The arrangement was comfortable and reasonably profitable. It was also, for a man of Flagler's restlessness, insufficient. When the Civil War created a sudden demand for salt, Flagler saw an opening and invested everything he had in a salt mining venture in Saginaw, Michigan. He borrowed heavily against his grain earnings, built evaporation works along the Saginaw River, and waited for the wartime premium to deliver the returns he had projected. The war ended. The salt premium vanished. Competitors with lower production costs and better access to markets flooded the trade. Flagler's operation collapsed entirely. He returned to Bellevue in 1866, owing debts that exceeded everything he had earned in a decade of grain trading, dependent on loans from his wife's family to keep himself solvent. He was 36 years old and starting over. The failure at Saginaw left a permanent mark on Flagler's commercial instincts. He would spend the rest of his career building structures designed to ensure he never again occupied a position where a shift in market conditions could destroy him. The lesson was not that speculation was dangerous. The lesson was that a man must control enough of the market to be insulated from its movements. It was through the Harkness family connection that Flagler encountered John Davison Rockefeller. Rockefeller was 9 years younger, a commission agent based in Cleveland who had recently left the grain business for the oil refining trade. By the mid-1860s, Cleveland had become the center of the American petroleum refining industry, positioned at the junction of the rail lines connecting the oil fields of western Pennsylvania to the ports of the eastern seaboard. Rockefeller, working with a chemist named Samuel Andrews, had built a small but notably efficient refinery on the banks of Kingsbury Run. What Rockefeller needed was capital. What Flagler had was access to it. Stephen V. Harkness, Flagler's stepbrother, agreed to invest $100,000 in Rockefeller's enterprise on one condition: that Henry Flagler be made a full partner. The partnership of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler was formally established in 1867. By the following year, their Cleveland refinery was already the largest in the world. Flagler, the bankrupt salt miner from Saginaw, was now a principal in the most rapidly expanding enterprise in American industry. The division of responsibility between the two men was immediate and enduring. Rockefeller was the long-range planner, the patient accumulator, the figure who thought in decades and kept meticulous ledgers. Flagler was the tactician and negotiator who understood that the petroleum industry's competitive structure turned not on the quality of refined oil, but on the cost of moving crude from the wellhead to the refinery. The railroads were the lever. In 1868, Flagler sat across the table from executives of the railroads serving Cleveland and extracted a secret shipping rate of $1.65 per barrel from Cleveland to New York City against an official published tariff of $2.40. The condition was volume: 60 carloads per day, every day, guaranteed. No other refiner in Cleveland could promise that kind of traffic. No other refiner, therefore, could match Standard Oil's delivered cost to market. This was Flagler's central insight, and it became the architectural principle of the Standard Oil monopoly. Control the transportation cost, and the competitor cannot survive on whatever margin remains. The insight extended further in 1871, when the South Improvement Company linked Standard Oil to the Pennsylvania, Erie, and New York Central Railroads in an arrangement that would have granted Standard not merely rebates on its own shipments, but drawbacks on every barrel shipped by competitors. The scheme collapsed under public outrage before any oil moved under its terms, and the Pennsylvania legislature revoked the company's charter. But the threat alone was sufficient. 22 of Cleveland's 26 independent refiners sold their operations to Standard Oil in the early months of 1872, in a consolidation that contemporaries and later historians called the Cleveland Massacre. In January of 1870, the partnership had already dissolved and reconstituted itself as the Standard Oil Company, a joint stock corporation organized under the laws of Ohio. It was Flagler, not Rockefeller, who conceived the incorporation. It was Flagler who drafted the charter, despite possessing no legal training. It was Flagler who recognized that the corporate form would allow the firm to raise capital through stock issuance, absorb competitors through share exchanges rather than cash outlays, and scale beyond the financial ceiling of a private partnership. When a reporter later asked Rockefeller whose idea Standard Oil had been, Rockefeller replied, "I wish I'd had the brains to think of it. It was Henry M. Flagler." The initial capitalization was $1 million, divided into 10,000 shares at $100 each. John Rockefeller received 2,667 shares. Flagler received 1,333. Andrews received the same. Stephen Harkness, the silent partner whose $100,000 loan from Bellevue had made the entire enterprise possible, received 1,334. William Rockefeller and Oliver Jennings held the remainder. Within a decade, the scale of what those 10,000 shares represented became fully visible. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled the refining of 90% of all petroleum produced in the United States. Its refineries in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Bayonne, New Jersey, processed crude into kerosene, lubricants, paraffin wax, and dozens of derivative products. Its pipeline network stretched thousands of miles from the western Pennsylvania oil regions to terminals on the Atlantic coast. At its height, the trust would operate tens of thousands of oil wells and employ tens of thousands of workers across dozens of states. Its kerosene lit the lamps of North America, Europe, and Asia. Its revenues dwarfed those of most institutions in American life, and its net value at dissolution in 1911 would exceed $375 million. Standard Oil was not merely the dominant corporation in the American petroleum industry. By several measures, it was the largest private commercial enterprise the world had ever produced. Flagler's personal share of that empire placed him among the wealthiest men in the country. His annual income from Standard Oil dividends alone ran into the millions of dollars, a figure that exceeded the operating budgets of most American state governments. He maintained residences in New York City and along the New Jersey shore. He moved through the upper echelons of Gilded Age society, attending the dinners and subscribing to the institutions of an era that treated extreme wealth as evidence of providential favor. But the oil fortune would not be Henry Flagler's legacy. The money he had drawn from American petroleum would fund a second career and a second empire, one that would reshape the physical geography of an entire state, raise cities where nothing had stood, and leave behind a trail of human cost that the grandeur of the achievement has largely obscured. The occasion for this transformation was personal. Mary Harkness Flagler, his first wife, had been in declining health for years, suffering from a respiratory condition that worsened each winter in the cold of New York. Her doctors recommended a warmer climate, and in the late 1870s, the Flaglers traveled south to Jacksonville, Florida, at that time the only city in the state accessible to northern visitors by rail. Florida below St. Augustine was a frontier in the plainest sense. Humid, undeveloped, its Atlantic coastline largely uninhabited, with no hotels of consequence, no reliable roads, and no transportation infrastructure south of the oldest city in America. Mary Flagler's condition did not improve. She died in 1881 at the age of 47 in New York. The loss was genuine. But something else had taken hold during those Florida winters. Flagler had seen the emptiness of the state's coastline, and he had recognized, with the same commercial instinct that had identified the railroad rebate as the lever of an entire industry, that Florida's undevelopment was not a limitation, it was raw material. He had begun. 2 years after Mary Harkness Flagler's death, Henry Flagler remarried. His second wife was Ida Alice Shords, a woman of 35 to his 53, who had entered the Flagler household as a nurse attending Mary during her final illness. Alice, as her friends called her, was a former actress from Philadelphia whose father had died when she was young and whose family had known years of financial difficulty. She was attractive, spirited, and socially ambitious. The circumstances of the courtship were unremarkable by the conventions of the Gilded Age, when widowed men of wealth frequently married younger women from their domestic circles. The fact that Alice had tended his dying first wife and then taken her place attracted little comment at the time. It would attract considerably more in retrospect. The newlyweds honeymooned in St. Augustine, Florida, in the winter of 1883. Flagler had visited the city before, during Mary's illness, and had been drawn to its warm air and its old Spanish architecture. But he had also been frustrated. St. Augustine in the 1880s possessed a certain faded grandeur from its 3 centuries of Spanish and British colonial settlement, but its tourist accommodations were primitive. The hotels were wooden structures, drafty in winter and sweltering in summer, unequal to the expectations of wealthy Northerners accustomed to the great resort hotels of Saratoga Springs and Newport, Rhode Island. The railroads connecting the city to Jacksonville and points north were narrow gauge, slow, and unreliable, their schedules subject to the weather, the condition of the roadbed, and the disposition of their operators. South of St. Augustine, the Atlantic coastline was nearly empty. Scattered homesteads and small farming settlements clung to the shore, but there were no roads of consequence, no port facilities, and no towns that a visitor from Manhattan or Boston would recognize as such. Florida had climate. It had nothing else. During this visit, Flagler encountered a private residence called the Villa Zoraida, recently constructed by a businessman named Franklin W. Smith in the Moorish Revival style. What captured Flagler's attention was not the architecture itself, but the building material. Smith had used poured concrete, mixing imported Portland cement with sand, and crushed coquina shell from nearby Anastasia Island. The result was a structure of unexpected solidity in a state where most buildings were wood, and most wood rotted within a decade in the subtropical humidity. Flagler studied the method carefully. He offered to buy the property outright. Smith refused. Flagler proposed a partnership to build a hotel together, with Flagler providing the capital and Smith contributing his construction expertise. Smith again declined. Flagler, who was not accustomed to being told no twice, decided to build one on his own. The Hotel Ponce de Leon would be unlike anything Florida had produced. Flagler retained the New York architectural firm of Carrère and Hastings, two young designers recently trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, for whom this commission would be their first major project. They would go on to design the New York Public Library and the House and Senate office buildings flanking the United States Capitol, but in 1885 they were unknown, and Flagler was the patron who launched their careers. The hotel was designed in the Spanish Renaissance style, with twin towers, an interior courtyard, and a grand dining room whose windows would be fitted with stained glass by Louis Comfort Tiffany. The entire structure was built of poured concrete, using the coquina aggregate technique Flagler had observed at Villa Zoraida, making it the first major poured-in-place concrete building constructed in the United States. The scale of the Ponce de Leon declared its builder's intentions. 540 guest rooms occupied the main structure and its wings. 4,000 electric light bulbs illuminated the hallways, parlors, and private suites, powered by direct current dynamos that Thomas Edison, a personal friend of Flagler, had traveled to St. Augustine to install and oversee himself. The hotel was one of the first buildings in the country designed from its foundations to carry electrical wiring, at a time when most American cities still relied on gaslight and kerosene. 2 water tanks holding 8,000 gallons each were concealed within the twin towers, supplying running water to every floor. The interiors carried Tiffany's stained glass, hand-laid mosaic tile floors, ornamental plasterwork, and carved oak paneling. The architects who designed it would complete more than 600 commissions over the course of their careers. None would be more ambitious than this first one, built for a Standard Oil partner who had decided to remake himself as a hotelier in the oldest city in America. The Ponce de Leon announced what Flagler intended for Florida, but the hotel was only the opening gesture in a campaign that would reach 400 miles south along the Atlantic coast. The cost of that campaign would prove to be measured in more than dollars. The hotel opened on January 10, 1888. The guests who arrived for the inaugural winter season were among the wealthiest families in the northeastern United States. Astors and Vanderbilts and their social peers transported south by rail to escape the cold. Many of them were encountering electrical illumination for the first time in a domestic setting. The switches mounted on the plastered walls of their suites were objects of genuine apprehension. Flagler's guests, accustomed to gas fixtures they understood and oil lamps they had operated since childhood, refused to touch the electrical controls, fearful that the wires concealed inside the walls might electrocute them or ignite the building. Flagler's response was characteristic. He hired a staff of attendants whose sole duty was to enter guest rooms at the appointed hours and operate the light switches on behalf of the occupants. It was an early and relatively minor demonstration of the principle that would define his entire Florida career. When an obstacle presented itself, Flagler did not explain, educate, or persuade. He spent money until the obstacle no longer existed. The hotel was an immediate success. Within a year, Flagler had opened a second property directly across the street, the Hotel Alcazar, designed by the same architects in a complementary Moorish style, with a casino, a swimming pool, and a gymnasium. A third hotel, the Casa Monica, was purchased and absorbed into the expanding Flagler system shortly after. St. Augustine had been transformed in less than 5 years from a sleepy coastal settlement into a winter resort destination for the American upper class, and Flagler had accomplished the transformation using Standard Oil dividends, borrowed architectural talent, and a level of personal financial commitment that no previous developer had brought to any state in the Union. But Flagler understood that hotels without transportation were monuments standing in a wilderness. A resort was useless if the guests could not reach it in comfort, and Florida's railroads were a patchwork of small, undercapitalized local lines that served farming communities and connected to no unified system. Beginning in the late 1880s, Flagler purchased these lines one at a time: the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax Railway, the St. John's Railway, the St. Augustine and Palatka Railway, and several smaller operations along the coast. He consolidated their management, standardized their track gauge, replaced their aging rolling stock, rebuilt their bridges and roadbeds, and began extending the main line south from St. Augustine along the Atlantic shore. By the mid-1890s, the unified system bore the name Florida East Coast Railway, and its tracks had reached West Palm Beach, more than 300 miles south of Jacksonville. The pattern that would define the next 2 decades of Flagler's life was now fully established, and it was unlike anything attempted by any previous American developer. The railroad advanced southward along the coast. A luxury hotel rose at each new terminus. A town grew around the hotel, platted and promoted by Flagler's land agents. Settlers followed, drawn by advertisements placed in northern newspapers and by the promise of inexpensive land, warm winters, and the proximity of Flagler's railroad to carry their produce to market. Each extension of the railroad created new land values and new demand for hotels. Each hotel created passengers and social prestige that drew further investment. Each town produced freight and travelers who moved on Flagler's rails and slept in Flagler's rooms. The system fed itself. "I have always been contented," Flagler once told an interviewer, "but I have never been satisfied." The remark was not a confession. It was a description of method, and the method was about to produce its most extravagant creation. The next stop on the Florida East Coast Railway was a narrow barrier island between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth, a strip of sand pine and palmetto scrub that no winter tourist had ever visited and no northern newspaper had ever mentioned. Flagler intended to turn it into the most exclusive winter address in the American social calendar. The place was Palm Beach. Palm Beach in 1893 was a barrier island of sand pine, sea grape, and palmetto scrub, separated from the mainland by the shallow waters of Lake Worth. A handful of settlers had homesteaded along the lakeshore. A few coconut palms, grown from the cargo of a Spanish shipwreck that had washed ashore decades earlier, gave the place a tropical character it had not originally possessed. The lake was shallow and warm, bordered by mangrove and sawgrass. The ocean side of the island was open beach, unbroken by any permanent structure. The nearest settlement of size was Juneau, the county seat of Dade County, a town of a few hundred people accessible only by boat. There was no hotel, no dock, and no reason for any visitor from the north to come unless they intended to fish or farm. Flagler intended something else entirely. The Royal Poinciana Hotel opened in February of 1894. 6 stories of yellow clapboard rising above the shore of Lake Worth, it contained 540 guest rooms at its opening, with a dining hall that seated 1,600 at a single service and manicured grounds, stretching from the lakefront to the ocean across the full width of the island. Subsequent expansions in 1899 and 1901 would more than double its capacity to over 1,000 rooms, making it the largest wooden structure and the largest resort hotel in the world. The hotel employed more than 1,400 workers during the winter season, from kitchen staff and chambermaids to groundskeepers and the operators of the hotel's private ferry. During the months of January through March, the guest register read like a directory of American industrial wealth. Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Whitneys, and Astors arrived by private rail car on Flagler's tracks, accompanied by personal servants and steamer trunks of evening clothes. The hotel was, by design, the most exclusive winter resort in the country, accessible only by the Florida East Coast Railway and priced to admit only the class of Americans who summered at Bar Harbor and wintered at Jekyll Island. Palm Beach did not grow around the Royal Poinciana. Palm Beach was the Royal Poinciana. The town existed because the hotel existed, and the hotel existed because Flagler had decided it should. 2 years later, a second hotel opened on the oceanfront side of the island, the Palm Beach Inn, later renamed the Breakers. Where the Royal Poinciana served the social season with its ballrooms, its orchestra, and its promenades along the lakefront, the Breakers offered the Atlantic itself, with guests stepping from their suites directly onto the sand. Together, the two properties established Palm Beach as the preeminent winter address for the American elite, a standing it has maintained for more than a century. The fact that both hotels, the railroad that served them, the land beneath them, and the town that surrounded them all belonged to a single individual was received by visitors and the press not as a matter of concern, but as a marvel of private enterprise. The hotels, however, were not where the money was made. Flagler's Florida operation was sustained by a mechanism considerably less visible than Spanish Renaissance architecture or the locomotive pulling into the Palm Beach depot. The government had maintained a long-standing program of granting land to railroad builders, typically awarding several thousand acres for every mile of track laid through undeveloped territory. As Flagler extended the Florida East Coast Railway southward from St. Augustine, the government deeded him vast tracts of coastal and interior land on both sides of the right-of-way. In Palm Beach County alone, Flagler accumulated more than 100,000 acres through these federal grants and through supplementary purchases from homesteaders willing to sell at prices the market of the moment dictated. In 1896, Flagler created the Model Land Company to manage and dispose of these holdings. The company, directed by his agent James Ingraham and supported by 3 subsidiary firms, sold parcels to incoming settlers at prices Flagler's office determined, under terms Flagler's attorneys drafted, in locations Flagler's surveyors had platted. The settlers who bought the land were, by the nature of Florida's geography and the absence of any competing transportation network, entirely dependent on Flagler's railroad to ship their citrus, their vegetables, and their lumber to the northern markets where buyers waited. They were equally dependent on the railroad to receive the goods, tools, building materials, and provisions they required to establish themselves. Flagler understood this dependency with arithmetic precision. "Every new settler is worth $300 a year to me," he explained. "He has to bring in everything he uses and send out everything he produces over my railroad." The calculation was frank, and it was the true engine of the Florida enterprise. The hotels attracted attention and wealthy guests. The railroad provided transportation. But the Model Land Company provided the revenue that kept both solvent. Flagler never earned a profit on his hotels. The railroad itself operated at a loss for most of its early decades. The land sales sustained the entire system. The settlers were not merely customers. They were, in the logic of the structure Flagler had designed, freight. The efficiency of the arrangement was, by Flagler's standards, complete. Its moral dimensions would declare themselves on a different schedule. The scope of Flagler's holdings gave him an authority in the state of Florida that extended well beyond commerce. He established and subsidized newspapers in St. Augustine, Miami, and other cities along the coast, ensuring that the editorial pages reflected his interests, promoted his developments, and defended his reputation when outside journalists raised questions about labor conditions or monopolistic practices. He built churches, donated to hospitals, financed the construction of municipal water systems and public buildings in the towns his railroad had created. His influence in the state capital at Tallahassee was proportional to his economic weight. Legislators who represented districts along the East Coast understood that the man who had constructed the railroad, the hotels, the towns, and the land company was not a constituent whose preferences could be conveniently set aside. Florida in the 1890s was not quite a company state in the manner of a Pennsylvania coal town or a West Virginia mining camp. But it was closer to that arrangement than its boosters and tourist brochures acknowledged, and the company was Flagler's. By 1895, the railroad had reached West Palm Beach, and Flagler might reasonably have declared his work finished. The coast south of Palm Beach was even more sparsely settled than the territory the line had already crossed, and the commercial justification for further extension grew thinner with every additional mile of track. But a woman named Julia Tuttle, a Cleveland-born widow who had purchased extensive acreage near the mouth of the Miami River on Biscayne Bay, had been urging Flagler for years to bring his railroad to her doorstep. Tuttle owned land, and Flagler owned the only transportation system that could give it value. Neither asset was worth its full potential without the other. The Great Freeze of 1894 and 1895, which devastated the citrus groves of northern and central Florida, provided Tuttle with her most persuasive argument. According to accounts that have become inseparable from the legend of Miami's founding, Tuttle sent Flagler a spray of fresh orange blossoms from her Biscayne Bay property, proof that the freeze had not reached the southern tip of the peninsula. Whether the blossoms arrived by post or were delivered by hand, the message was received. The railroad pushed south. The first passenger train reached the new terminus on the shore of Biscayne Bay in April of 1896. The settlement that greeted the locomotive consisted of approximately 300 people, most of them homesteaders and Seminole traders living in wooden structures scattered along the north bank of the Miami River. There was no municipal charter, no paved street, and no permanent building of masonry or stone. Flagler immediately began construction of the Royal Palm Hotel on the riverbank and platted the streets of what would become downtown Miami. Within 4 years, the settlement had incorporated as a city. By 1900, the Florida East Coast Railway stretched more than 350 miles from Jacksonville to Miami, the longest single-owner rail system in the state. Flagler's hotel properties now included the Ponce de Leon and the Alcazar in St. Augustine, the Ormond Hotel near Daytona, the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers in Palm Beach, and the Royal Palm in Miami. His model land company and its subsidiaries controlled hundreds of thousands of acres of coastal and agricultural land from the Georgia border to Biscayne Bay. His newspapers shaped opinion in every significant town along the route. His allies sat in the state legislature. One man, using the dividends of a petroleum monopoly, had built the transportation system, the hospitality industry, the press, and the settlement pattern of the entire Atlantic coast of Florida. But the man who was remaking that coastline was simultaneously presiding over the disintegration of his own household. Ida Alice Flagler, the former nurse who had become the second Mrs. Flagler in 1883, had been exhibiting behavior for several years that alarmed the household staff, bewildered the social circles of St. Augustine and New York, and presented her husband with a problem that neither money nor the influence of the Florida legislature could resolve on its existing terms. The resolution Flagler would devise required him to do something he had already done once before in the petroleum industry: change the rules entirely. The deterioration of Ida. Alice Flagler's mental health began in the early 1890s, around the time her husband's attention shifted decisively from their domestic life in New York and St. Augustine to the southward expansion of his Florida empire. The precise nature of her condition was never diagnosed in terms that later generations of physicians would recognize. What the household servants and the social circles of St. Augustine and Mamaroneck, New York, observed was a woman who had once been vivacious and socially capable, descending over a period of months and then years into behavior that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. Alice became consumed by spiritualism, and particularly by the Ouija board, which she consulted with increasing frequency and with progressively less connection to observable reality. She declared that the Czar of Russia had fallen in love with her and was communicating his devotion through the spirit board. She told visitors and household staff that her husband was conducting affairs, announcements that may or may not have originated in delusion, but were certainly delivered without the discretion that Gilded Age society demanded of its women. She gave away jewelry and sums of money to people she barely knew. She behaved erratically at social gatherings where the expectations of conduct were rigid and the penalties for violating them were permanent. The woman who had once hosted dinners for the Astors and the Harrimans at the Flagler residence Kirkside in St. Augustine, who had sailed the coast aboard the yacht her husband had named the Alicia in her honor, was becoming a figure of pity and social alarm. By 1895, Alice's condition had worsened to the point where Flagler sought medical intervention. She was placed under the care of Dr. Carlos MacDonald, a prominent alienist in New York, and transferred to his private sanitarium in Pleasantville, a quiet town in Westchester County. The institution was expensive, secluded, and designed to accommodate patients of substantial means whose families preferred that their difficulties remain outside the reach of the metropolitan press. The New York Supreme Court subsequently reviewed Alice's case and issued a ruling of incurable delusional insanity, a legal designation that removed her from the management of her own affairs and placed her permanently under institutional supervision. Alice Flagler was approximately 47 years old. She would remain in the Pleasantville Sanitarium for the rest of her natural life. What followed was not, in the narrow legal definition, a crime. But it required the cooperation of an entire state legislature, and it produced a piece of American statutory law that has no precedent and no successor. It was during this period, while his second wife occupied a room in Westchester County, from which she would never voluntarily depart, that Henry Flagler began a relationship with Mary Lily Keenan, a woman of 34 from a wealthy and socially prominent North Carolina family. The two met at a gathering in Palm Beach in the late 1890s. Mary Lily was educated, accomplished as a pianist and singer, and nearly 4 decades younger than the man who pursued her. Flagler's attentions were neither subtle nor private. He presented her with jewelry valued at more than $1 million. He traveled with her through the resort towns of the eastern seaboard in full view of the society columns. Their appearances together at dinners and charity functions left no ambiguity about the nature of the relationship. By 1899, the arrangement was an open secret in every drawing room from Palm Beach to Fifth Avenue in New York. The obstacle was legal, and it was absolute. Flagler wished to marry Mary Lily Keenan, but he could not obtain a divorce from Alice under the existing statutes of either state in which he maintained a legal residence. Neither New York nor Florida recognized incurable insanity as grounds for the dissolution of a marriage. A marriage, under the law as it stood, was a permanent bond, and a spouse's descent into madness did not sever it. In New York, where the commitment had been adjudicated, Flagler's attorneys concluded that amending the divorce statute was a political impossibility. The legislature was too large, its interests too diffuse, and its proceedings too visible to accommodate a bill drafted for the private convenience of a single petitioner. Florida was a different matter entirely. In Florida, Flagler was not a petitioner, he was the economy. Documents uncovered in the middle of the 20th century indicate that the cost of revising Florida's divorce statute was $125,000, a sum equivalent to several million in later currency. The money moved through intermediaries and arrived in Tallahassee. A legislator aligned with Flagler's interests introduced a bill providing that a marriage could be legally dissolved if one spouse had been adjudicated incurably insane and had been continuously institutionalized for a period of at least 4 years. The bill passed both chambers of the Florida legislature. The governor signed it into law. Ida Alice Flagler's commitment at the Pleasantville Sanitarium had commenced in 1895. The new statute took effect in 1901. The 4-year threshold was precisely satisfied. Flagler filed for divorce in a Miami courtroom, in a city that owed its incorporation to his railroad, and in which his legal and commercial connections were beyond challenge. Notice of his intent to divorce was published in local newspapers and posted at the Dade County Courthouse. The proceedings encountered no opposition. 10 days after the divorce was granted, on the 24th of August, 1901, Henry Morrison Flagler married Mary Lily Keenan at her family's estate, Liberty Hall, in Keenansville, North Carolina. He was 71 years old. His bride was 34. The response in Florida was sharp and divided, along lines that Flagler's influence could predict, but not entirely suppress. The state's clergy denounced the law as a transparent manipulation of the legislative process for the benefit of one man. Ministers delivered sermons condemning the arrangement from pulpits in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Tallahassee. Editorialists in newspapers, not controlled by the Flagler system, wrote that the legislature had sold the sanctity of marriage for the price of a railroad magnate's convenience. Flagler's own papers, naturally, did not amplify the criticism. The broader public, much of which depended on the Florida East Coast Railway for employment and on the Model Land Company for property, offered little organized opposition. Within 4 years, the Florida legislature repealed the statute, responding to sustained pressure from religious organizations and civic groups who regarded it as a stain on the state's legal code. Henry Flagler was the only person who had ever been divorced under its provisions. The law remains the only divorce statute in American history enacted for one man's benefit and revoked after he exercised it. As a wedding gift for Mary Lily Keenan, Flagler constructed a winter residence in Palm Beach called Whitehall. The mansion contained 55 rooms, including a grand ballroom, a music salon, a billiard room, a library, and a marble entrance hall, whose proportions were modeled on the great houses of the European aristocracy. The period press pronounced it the finest private dwelling in the country. It was completed in 1902, and Mary Lily presided over its social seasons as the acknowledged center of Palm Beach society, hosting the same industrial families whose names filled the guest registers of the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers. 1,200 miles to the north, in a room at the Pleasantville Sanitarium, Ida Alice Flagler continued to exist. Flagler paid for her care, a sum reported by contemporaries as considerable but never publicly disclosed. He did not visit her. He did not write to her. He did not, so far as the surviving record indicates, speak of her again in any context that was preserved. Alice Flagler died in the sanitarium in 1930 at the age of 82. She had been confined for 35 years. She had spent more than 12,700 days under institutional supervision while her former husband built an overseas railroad, gave a 55-room mansion to a younger woman, and died in the entrance hall of that mansion 17 years before Alice herself drew her final breath. The nurse who had tended the first Mrs. Flagel in her last illness had become the second Mrs. Flagel, had been declared insane, had been legally discarded through a purchased statute, and had been written out of the narrative of the empire her husband was constructing. The symmetry was complete, and it was entirely of Henry Flagler's making, but the Standard Oil fortune that Flagler had poured into Florida would follow a still more troubling course. After his own death, traveling through a suspicious remarriage, a secret exhumation in the middle of the night, and a contested codicil that transformed petroleum money into a newspaper dynasty in Louisville, Kentucky, that reckoning lay several years in the future. For the present, Flagler had turned the full weight of his attention and his remaining fortune to the project that would consume the last decade of his life and test the outer boundary of what American money and American engineering could accomplish against the open ocean. The destination was Key West, 128 miles across the water. The idea of connecting the Florida Keys to the mainland by rail had circulated in engineering and commercial circles since at least the 1870s. The Great Southern Railroad, incorporated in 1870, had proposed a line running from Georgia to Key West, but the project never advanced beyond surveyors' maps and promotional literature. The concept surfaced again in 1896, when Jefferson B. Brown published an essay in National Geographic arguing for the strategic and economic advantages of linking the island city to the continent. But no one had possessed both the capital and the tolerance for risk to attempt such a thing until Henry Flagler, in the winter of 1904, put a question to his chief aide, Joseph Parrott, that contained its own answer. "Are you sure this railway can be built?" The motive was commercial and strategic in equal measure. Key West was the closest deep-water port in the United States to the Panama Canal, then under construction by the United States Army Corps of Engineers and expected to reshape the shipping lanes of the Western Hemisphere upon its completion. Cuban trade was already passing through Key West in substantial volume. A railroad connecting the island to the mainland would allow cargo to move directly from the port onto the national rail network, eliminating the cost and delay of transshipment by sea. Flagler, who had spent 4 decades extracting profit from transportation advantages, recognized the opportunity with the same instinct that had once identified the Cleveland to New York barrel rate as the lever of the petroleum industry. The man who had mastered the movement of oil now proposed to master the movement of goods across open ocean. Construction began in 1905, starting at Homestead, the southernmost settlement on the Florida mainland, and pushing south across the chain of low limestone islands and stretches of open water that separated the tip of the peninsula from Key West. The difficulties were immediate and unrelenting. The Keys offered almost nothing that a construction project of this magnitude required. There was no reliable source of fresh water. There was no local supply of lumber, steel, cement, or aggregate. The heat during the summer months was severe, the mosquitoes were a genuine hazard to health and morale, and the nearest depot of food and construction materials was the mainland, reachable only by boat. Workers fought the insects with pyrethrum powder and smudge pots that burned through the night. They slept in temporary camps pitched on the narrow islands and on houseboats anchored in the shallow channels between the keys. At the height of construction, the workforce numbered as many as 4,000 men. They were drawn from the populations that performed the most dangerous physical labor in the American South at the turn of the century. Recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Southern Europe, African-American laborers recruited from across the Gulf states, and, by several contemporary accounts, convict workers obtained through the leasing arrangements that Southern state governments maintained as a successor institution to the forced labor systems of the antebellum period. The conditions along the construction line were harsh enough to attract the attention of muckraking journalists from the northern press, who traveled to the Keys, investigated the camps, and published accounts describing what they called industrialist slavery. Flagler's response followed a pattern he had established on the mainland. He deployed the newspaper he controlled, running front-page stories in the Florida Times-Union that contradicted the muckrakers' reports and offered an alternative portrait of well-maintained camps and adequately compensated workers. One such dispatch, preserved in the archival record, assured readers that the most physically demanding clearing work along the right-of-way was being performed by black laborers on the grounds that they were, in the newspaper's phrasing, accustomed to the use of an axe. It was an early and instructive example of a man using his ownership of a press organ to reshape the public narrative of his own enterprise. The project manager, Joseph Meredith, offered a less polished assessment of the work and the men who performed it. "No man has any business connected with this work," Meredith told his subordinates, "who can't stand grief." The grief arrived with regularity. 3 major hurricanes struck the construction zone during the 7 years of building, in 1906, 1909, and 1910. The 1906 storm was the most lethal. It struck in October with inadequate warning, catching laborers on the exposed keys and on the houseboats moored in the shallow waters offshore. The wind tore a large houseboat carrying workers from its anchorage and broke it apart. Approximately 130 men were killed in a single night. After the storm, Flagler and his engineers enacted more stringent safety measures, including the construction of dormitories on higher ground and improved systems for tracking approaching weather. The precautions reduced the toll on subsequent storms, but could not eliminate it. The 1909 hurricane injured dozens of workers, some of whom were struck by airborne debris or swept from the temporary scaffolding that served as their work platforms above the water. A writer named Winthrop Packard, traveling through the Keys by rail in 1909, described the scene from his carriage window. Men clinging to slender staging or balanced on insecure footholds above the surf, swaying to one side to let the passing train clear them, then swaying back to resume their labor. A fellow passenger, whom Packard described as a lean and knob-muscled laborer, sat up in visible excitement at the sight of his former workmates on the scaffolding below. The man was returning from 5 months of convalescence in a hospital after the previous hurricane had lifted him bodily from his tent while he was eating dinner, hurled him against a pile of railroad iron, and broke his leg and several other bones. He was coming back to the line. Over the full course of construction, more than 200 workers died building the overseas railroad. The dead were buried where they fell or where the sea deposited their remains, on scattered keys along the route, in graves that were frequently unmarked and have largely been absorbed by the landscape. The engineering that consumed those lives was, by any structural measure, without precedent. The overseas railroad required the construction of concrete piers sunk into the ocean floor, connected by arches that spanned the open water between them. Where the depth permitted, the piers were founded on bedrock. Where the water was too deep or the seafloor too soft for direct bearing, the engineers drove pilings and built cofferdams to pour concrete underwater. The 7-mile bridge, connecting Knight's Key to Little Duck Key, was the longest overwater railroad bridge in the world at the time of its completion. The Bahia Honda Bridge, crossing a channel where the water depth exceeded anything the standard concrete arch design could safely span, required structural steel trusses for additional support, making it the only segment of the overseas railroad constructed on a fundamentally different engineering principle than the rest of the line. The numbers, assembled in sequence, described a project that had no parallel in American civil engineering. 128 miles of railroad track extending across open ocean, more than 20 miles of bridges and viaducts spanning water where no land existed, concrete piers driven to depths of 30 feet and more below the surface of the Atlantic. A workforce that at peak operation consumed 600 tons of construction material per day, delivered by supply boats from the mainland. 3 hurricanes survived and absorbed. 7 years of continuous construction in conditions that no other railroad project in the country had faced. More than 200 lives lost to storm, accident, heat, and disease. A total expenditure estimated at between $20 and $50 million, a sum that represented a significant fraction of the fortune Flagler had accumulated over a lifetime in the petroleum industry. When the final rail was laid and the last bridge tested under load, the overseas railroad connected Jacksonville to Key West along a single continuous line of track, the only railroad in the world that crossed open ocean for the majority of its terminal segment. The railroad was nearly complete. Henry Flagler was 81 years old. His eyesight had been deteriorating for years, the consequence of age and a lifetime of close work over ledgers and engineering drawings, and by 1911 he was nearly blind. The man who had seen Florida as raw material, who had looked at sand and swamp and recognized an empire, could no longer see the coastline he had built. The completion ceremony was set for the 22nd of January, 1912. The first train to Key West departed from the mainland on the morning of the 22nd of January, 1912, carrying Henry Morrison Flagler and a small party of dignitaries south across the bridges and viaducts of the overseas railroad. The journey covered 128 miles of track, much of it suspended above open water, with no land visible in any direction for long stretches of the crossing. A writer named John Dos Passos would later describe the experience of riding the overseas railroad as a dream journey, the train moving through empty sky above an ocean that seemed to extend beneath the rails without limit or explanation. Flagler was 82 years old. He was seated in a wheelchair. His eyesight, which had been failing for years, had declined to near total blindness. When the train arrived at the Key West terminal at approximately 10:43 that morning, a crowd numbering in the thousands filled the platform and the streets beyond it. Flagler was helped from the rail car onto the platform. He stood, briefly, in the warm air. He wept. An aide recorded the words he spoke as he listened to the cheering and the voices of children who had been brought to witness the occasion. "I can hear the children," Flagler said, "but I cannot see them." The newspapers called the overseas railroad the eighth wonder of the world. It was, by any measure of engineering ambition, an extraordinary accomplishment. A railroad built across open ocean by a man who had financed it from petroleum dividends and overseen its construction from his 9th decade into near-total blindness. For a single day in January of 1912, the achievement was permitted to stand on its own terms, unqualified by the lives it had consumed or the economics it had failed to satisfy. But the railroad Flagler had built at such human and financial cost was, from the moment of its completion, a commercial disappointment. The anticipated trade from Cuba and the Panama Canal never materialized in the volumes that had justified the investment. Freight revenue was modest. Passenger traffic was seasonal and insufficient to cover operating expenses in any year the line operated. The engineering was sound. The economics were not. The greatest destruction, however, was still 23 years in the future. The railroad that had survived 3 hurricanes during construction would not survive a 4th. Henry Morrison Flagler did not live long enough to see the failure fully confirmed. On the 20th of May, 1913, 16 months after his arrival in Key West, Flagler fell on a marble staircase at Whitehall, the 55-room Palm Beach mansion he had constructed as a wedding gift for Mary Lily Keenan. The injuries proved fatal. He was 83 years old. A funeral train carried his body north along the tracks of the Florida East Coast Railway to St. Augustine, where he was interred in the Memorial Presbyterian Church he had built decades earlier in memory of his first wife, Mary Harkness, and their daughter Jenny Louise, who had died in infancy. As the funeral train passed each station along the route, every wheel of the Florida East Coast Railway remained motionless for a period of 10 minutes in silent tribute to its great builder. The estate Flagler left behind was enormous, but concentrated in the hands of a single heir. His only surviving son, Harry Harkness Flagler, from his first marriage, had been estranged from his father for years. The reasons for the estrangement were never made fully public, though contemporaries attributed it to disagreements over Henry's treatment of Ida Alice and his remarriage to a woman closer in age to Harry than to Henry himself. Harry received a modest share of the estate, sufficient to sustain a comfortable life, but bearing no resemblance to the fortune's true scale. The bulk of the wealth, estimated at between $60 million and $100 million, passed to Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, making her one of the wealthiest women in the United States, and, by several contemporary assessments, in the world. Mary Lily's widowhood lasted 3 years. In November of 1916, she married Robert Worth Bingham, a judge and political figure from Louisville, Kentucky. Before the wedding, at the insistence of the Keenan family, Bingham signed a prenuptial agreement renouncing all claims to the Flagler estate. The precaution reflected both the magnitude of the fortune and the reservations that Mary Lily's relatives had harbored about Bingham's motives from the earliest days of the courtship. The marriage lasted 8 months. On July 27, 1917, during a severe heat wave in Louisville, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler Bingham was found unconscious at the Bingham residence on the outskirts of the city. She died shortly afterward. She was 50 years old. The death certificate listed brain swelling as the primary cause, with heart disease as a contributing factor. The Keenan family did not accept this explanation. Acting without Bingham's knowledge, members of the family arranged for Mary Lily's body to be quietly exhumed from the Keenan family plot at Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, North Carolina. A private autopsy was performed. The findings, according to accounts that circulated through the press and through subsequent historical investigations, revealed significant quantities of morphine in Mary Lily's system and traces of heavy metals in her tissues. No official report was ever released to the public. No criminal charges were filed against Bingham or against any of the physicians who had attended Mary Lily during his declining months in Louisville. Newspapers ran headlines suggesting foul play and murder. The precise circumstances of her death have never been resolved, and the case remains one of the enduring unsettled episodes of Gilded Age wealth. What is settled is what happened to the money. Shortly before her death, Mary Lily had added a codicil to her will, granting Robert Worth Bingham $5 million. The Keenan family contested the amendment, viewing it as evidence of undue influence during a period of declining health. They did not ultimately succeed in blocking its execution. Bingham received the $5 million. The Keenans received the remaining estate, estimated at approximately $95 million, equivalent to more than $2 billion. Over the decades that followed, the Keenan family directed the Flagler fortune into the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, into hospitals and medical research facilities, into libraries and civic buildings across the American South. The petroleum money that Henry Flagler had drawn from Cleveland refineries and invested in Florida sand became, in the Keenans' hands, the physical infrastructure of Southern higher education and public health. Bingham's $5 million traveled a different path. In July of 1918, he used the first installment of his inheritance to purchase the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times, founding a newspaper dynasty that would shape Kentucky journalism and Democratic Party politics for 7 decades. He gained the confidence of President Franklin Roosevelt, who appointed him United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James in 1933. He died in London in 1937. The arc of transmission was complete. Standard Oil petroleum money, refined in Cleveland, invested in Florida railroads and hotels, inherited by a young wife, passed through a suspicious death and a contested codicil, and converted into the purchase price of a newspaper that would influence American political life for the remainder of the 20th century. Henry Flagler's name by this time was attached to a Florida county, a college built inside his first great hotel, a museum housed in the mansion he had given away as a wedding present, and an entire coastline. His second wife had died in the asylum where he had placed her. His third wife had died under circumstances that no investigation had resolved. His railroad across the open Atlantic was still operating, still losing money, and still exposed to the one force that Flagler's wealth had never been able to purchase or negotiate away. The wind was coming. 22 years after Flagler's death, on the 2nd of September 1935, a hurricane formed over the Atlantic east of the Bahamas and moved westward toward the Florida Keys. It was Labor Day. The storm intensified with a speed that the Weather Bureau's instruments and forecasting methods of the era could not adequately track. By the time it made landfall on the Upper Keys that evening, it had become the most powerful hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere at that date. Sustained winds reached 185 miles per hour. The barometric pressure fell to 26.35 inches of mercury, the lowest reading ever documented in the Atlantic Basin. The storm surge, a wall of seawater driven ahead of the wind, rose 18 to 20 feet above the normal tide. It was the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the United States. On the Keys that night were several hundred men, most of them veterans of the First World War who had been sent to the Florida Keys under the federal government's New Deal work relief programs. They were employed building bridges and roadbed for the Overseas Highway, the automobile road that was to follow the route of Flagler's railroad. They lived in temporary camps on Windley Key and Lower Matecumbe Key, in wooden barracks and canvas shelters that offered no protection against a storm of this magnitude. When the hurricane's trajectory became clear, authorities in Jacksonville dispatched a rescue train south along the Florida East Coast Railway to evacuate the camps. The train departed too late. The storm surge swept across the low-lying keys before the evacuation could be completed, derailing the rescue train at Islamorada and pushing its locomotive and passenger cars off the tracks and into the churning water. The camps were obliterated. The men inside them were killed by wind, by surge, and by debris that the storm carried at fatal velocity across the islands. Approximately 400 people died in the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, among them more than 200 of the veterans who had been laboring on the highway. Their remains were gathered in the days that followed and cremated on improvised pyres along the right-of-way. A stone crypt at mile marker 82 in Islamorada holds their ashes. A monument of native coral rock, unveiled in 1937 before a gathering of 4,000 mourners, marks the place where they were lost. The hurricane destroyed the Overseas Railroad. Miles of steel track were torn from the roadbed and twisted beyond recovery. The wooden trestles and approach ramps were reduced to floating debris scattered across the channels between the islands. The railroad that Henry Flagler had spent 7 years and a substantial portion of his petroleum fortune constructing was eliminated in a single night. It was never rebuilt. The Florida East Coast Railway sold the remnants of the overseas line to the state of Florida, and the right-of-way was converted into the roadbed of U.S. Route 1, the overseas highway that carries traffic through the Keys today. But the concrete held. The piers that Flagler's workers had sunk into the ocean floor between 1905 and 1912, the arches they had poured and cured above the open water, the massive foundations of the 7-Mile Bridge and the Bahia Honda Bridge survived the hurricane that destroyed the steel and timber above them. They survive still. Every automobile that drives the Florida Keys from the mainland to Key West crosses infrastructure that was designed, financed, and built by the Florida East Coast Railway more than a century ago. The old railroad bridges, weathered to the color of the surrounding coral and limestone, stand alongside the modern highway spans, visible from the road at every crossing, carrying nothing, connecting nothing, and refusing to fall. Whitehall still stands in Palm Beach, preserved as the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum. Its 55 rooms open to visitors who walk through the marble entrance hall where its builder fell to his death. The Hotel Ponce de Leon still stands in St. Augustine, its 540 rooms and its Edison-installed electrical system and its Tiffany stained glass serving as the central campus of Flagler College. Miami, the settlement of 300 people that greeted the first train at Biscayne Bay in 1896, is home to more than 6 million people in its metropolitan area. The Royal Poinciana, which at its peak had been the largest wooden structure in the world, was demolished in 1935, the same year the hurricane took the railroad. The Breakers, rebuilt twice after fires, remains the most prestigious winter address in Palm Beach. In the Flagler Museum, on the second floor, there is a small bedroom furnished with photographs from Ida Alice Flagler's 10 years of marriage before she was confined to the asylum, where she would spend the remaining 35 years of her life. The guided tour passes through it in approximately 1 minute. Henry Morrison Flagler built an empire out of petroleum money, Florida sand, and the labor of men whose names were never recorded. He captured an entire coastline the way his contemporaries captured industries, through capital, through infrastructure, through the systematic elimination of alternatives. The concrete he poured into the ocean floor more than a century ago carries traffic today. The laws he purchased have been repealed. The women whose lives his ambition consumed are buried in places that bear other families' names. What remains is the scale of the thing he built and the quiet around what it cost. This has been an Empire of Acres documentary. If the history behind the places and dynasties that shaped this country interests you, please like and subscribe. More investigations are forthcoming.